The sound stopped first. That was what everyone remembered later. The steady beeping that filled the emergency room for hours suddenly faded into one long, unbroken tone. Flat, cold, final. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to freeze, as if even the air itself was afraid to move. Doctors stood still around the hospital bed, their gloves stained, their shoulders heavy. Some looked at the floor. Others stared at the silent monitor, hoping, almost praying, that the line would jump again. But it didn't. It remained straight, sharp, unforgiving. At the foot of the bed stood Richard Halvorsen, a man whose name carried power in every corner of the city. Billionaire, investor, builder of towers that touched the clouds. A man who could buy almost anything. But in that moment, he looked small. His eyes were locked on his 12-year-old son, Daniel, lying pale and motionless beneath the white hospital sheets. The machines surrounding the boy were the best money could buy. The doctors in the room were among the finest in the country. Private jets had flown specialists in overnight. Nothing had been spared. And still, it wasn't enough. A nurse stepped closer to Richard, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "We're sorry. There's nothing more we can do." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard didn't respond. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just stood there, staring, as if refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. His hand rested on the metal railing of the bed, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of machines powering down. And then, from somewhere beyond the doorway, a voice spoke. "Please, let me try." It was quiet, thin, almost fragile, but in the silence, it sounded loud enough to stop every heart in the room. Heads turned. Standing in the doorway was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 13. His clothes were worn and dusty, hanging loosely from his thin frame. His feet were bare, darkened by dirt and long days on hard pavement. His hair was uncombed, and his face carried the tired look of someone who had seen too many cold nights. For a moment, no one moved. The scene was so unexpected, so out of place, that it felt unreal. Then security reacted. "Hey, you can't be in here," one of the guards snapped, stepping forward quickly. But the boy didn't run. He didn't even step back. His eyes were fixed on the hospital bed, on the still form of Daniel. "I know how to help him," the boy said softly. A doctor let out a short, bitter laugh. Another shook his head, already turning away. To them, the boy was nothing more than a distraction, a strange interruption at the worst possible moment. Richard barely glanced at him. In his world, people like this boy were invisible. Street children existed on sidewalks, at traffic lights, in the background of life, not inside private hospital wings. "Remove him," one of the doctors said firmly. A guard reached for the boy's arm, but the boy spoke again, his voice trembling but determined. "Please, just 1 minute." There was something in his tone, not arrogance, not desperation alone. Something deeper, something steady. The guard hesitated, just for a second, and in that second, the boy took a step forward into the room. The bright hospital lights revealed more details now. The small scars on his hands, the thinness of his wrists, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He looked tired, hungry even, but there was also a strange calm about him, as if fear had long ago stopped controlling him. One of the nurses frowned. "How did you even get in here?" The boy didn't answer. His gaze never left Daniel. Richard finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "This is not a place of games." The boy turned to him then, and for the first time, their eyes met. "I'm not playing," the boy said quietly. "He needs help." The simplicity of those words seemed to echo in the room. A doctor stepped forward, irritation clear in his voice. "We have done everything possible. Everything. You need to leave." But the boy didn't move. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from urgency. "I've seen this before," he said. Sometimes the heart just needs." "That's enough," the doctor interrupted sharply. Silence fell again. Richard exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. Grief and exhaustion pressed down on him like a weight. He didn't have the strength to argue with strangers, or with children who spoke of miracles. But something inside him, something small, almost buried, hesitated. What if? The thought came and went in an instant, but it left a trace behind. He looked at his son again. Pale, still, gone, according to every expert in the room. What harm could 1 minute do? Richard closed his eyes briefly, then spoke without looking at the boy. 1 minute. The doctors protested immediately. Mr. Halvorsen, this is highly inappropriate. 1 minute, Richard repeated, his voice firm now. The room fell quiet again, this time filled with disbelief. The boy stepped closer to the bed. Every movement he made was careful, almost reverent, as if he understood the weight of the moment better than anyone else in the room. He stood beside Daniel, looking down at him, and for a brief second, sadness crossed his face to sadness that suggested he understood loss far too well. The doctors watched with folded arms, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. To them, this was pointless. A delay. Nothing more. But the boy didn't seem to notice them. He leaned slightly closer, studying Daniel's face, listening, feeling, as if searching for something invisible. The room held its breath. Even the guards stood still now. Even the nurses stopped moving. Even Richard found himself watching, really watching, for the first time since the machines had gone silent. Seconds passed. And in those seconds, something shifted, not in the machines, not yet, but in the room itself. The heavy despair began to give way to something else. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. And sometimes curiosity is the first step toward a miracle. No one in that room knew what was about to happen next. No one knew that the thin, barefoot boy standing beside the hospital bed was about to change lives in ways none of them could imagine. And in the quiet, just before everything changed, the boy slowly reached out his trembling hand. The first protest came like a crack of thunder in a quiet sky. This is absurd, one of the senior doctors snapped, his voice sharp with disbelief. We cannot allow this. This is a hospital, not a street corner. The tension in the room thickened instantly. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances. The guard stepped closer, reaching for the thin boy's arm, ready to escort him out. To them, this was already over. The machines had spoken. The child in the bed was gone. Nothing more could be done. But the boy pulled back, not with anger, not with force, but with a quiet desperation that stopped the guard for just a second. Please, he whispered, and his voice trembled like a candle in the wind. I've seen this before. I helped someone once. Just 1 minute. That's all I need. The word sounded small in a room filled with power, titles, and authority. A barefoot boy speaking to men who had studied medicine for decades. A child with no name, no status, no place here, asking for time. Richard Halvorsen turned slowly, and when his eyes met the boy's, there was anger in them, raw and sharp, born from grief. Do you have any idea who my son is? He demanded, his voice low but heavy. This is not a place of games. The boy lowered his gaze, but he did not step back. His hands were shaking now, but his voice, when he spoke again, was steady. I know who he is, he said quietly. He's a boy who needs help. The room fell silent. Those words did something strange. They cut through the noise, through the titles, through the power. For a brief moment, the billionaire, the doctors, the guards, they were all just people standing around a child who might be gone forever. One of the nurses swallowed hard. Another looked down at the floor. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something softer than anger. The boy had not spoken with arrogance. He had not begged for money or attention. He had spoken as if Daniel were not a billionaire's son, but simply a boy, and that truth lingered in the air. The doctor began to argue again, their voices low but urgent. This is inappropriate. This would cause legal issues. We cannot allow untrained individuals to interfere. Richard raised a hand, and the room went quiet. For a long moment, he stared at his son's still face, the pale skin, the closed eyes, the silence where laughter used to be. The weight of helplessness pressed on him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and tired. 1 minute. The doctor stared at him in disbelief. Mr. Halvorsen. 1 minute, he repeated, not raising his voice, but leaving no room for argument. The guard stepped back reluctantly. The boy exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. Then he began to walk toward the bed. Every step seemed to echo in the quiet room. His bare feet made almost no sound on the polished floor, yet somehow everyone felt each step as if it were a drumbeat. He reached the bedside and stopped. For a moment, he simply looked at Daniel. Really looked. His eyes softened and something like sadness passed over his face, as if he understood what it meant to lose someone. Then he leaned closer. The doctors watched with folded arms, their expressions tight with skepticism. One of them glanced at his watch, already counting down the seconds, certain this would end in nothing but disappointment. The boy placed his ear gently against Daniel's chest, listening, not to the silence, but for something deeper, something faint, something hidden. The room held its breath. Even the machine seemed quieter now. Then the boy moved his hand slowly, carefully, until his fingers rested against a precise spot near Daniel's ribcage. His touch was light, almost delicate, as if he were afraid to disturb something fragile. And then he began to press. Not randomly, not blindly. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, almost practiced. Under his breath, he whispered something so soft that no one could hear the words. It sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a memory. 30 seconds passed. Nothing happened. A doctor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Another looked away, already certain of the outcome. The guard near the door shifted his weight, preparing to step forward again. Richard felt his hope slipping, fragile as glass. He had allowed this moment, allowed this boy to try, and now the silence was returning, heavier than before. A full minute passed. Still nothing. One of the doctors stepped forward. "That's enough," he said quietly. "It's time to—" The monitor flickered. It was so brief that at first no one was sure they had seen it. Just a tiny movement, a faint jump on the flat line. The doctor froze. The nurse nearest the machine leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. And then it happened again. A faint sound broke the silence. Beep. It was weak, fragile, almost imaginary. Everyone in the room turned toward the monitor at the same time. Beep. The sound came again, slightly stronger. A nurse gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. One of the doctors stepped closer, staring at the screen as if he no longer trusted his own eyes. The line on the monitor moved again. Beep. The room erupted into motion. Nurses rushed forward. Doctors leaned over the bed, checking readings, calling for equipment, their voices urgent now, filled not with doubt but with disbelief. Richard stood frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He looked at the monitor, then at his son, then at the boy. The thin, barefoot boy stepped back slowly, as if trying not to get in the way. His face was calm, but his eyes were tired, as though the effort had taken something from him. Daniel's chest rose slightly. A breath, faint but real. The nurse whispered, almost in shock, "He's breathing." The doctors exchanged stunned looks. None of them spoke the question aloud, but it hung in the air between them. How? Richard's legs felt weak. He reached for the railing of the bed to steady himself. His eyes filling with tears, he did not even try to hide. For the first time since the flat line had appeared, there was hope in the room. But even as the machine began to beep steadily, even as the staff worked quickly to stabilize the boy in the bed, another silence began to grow. A different kind of silence. All eyes slowly turned toward the boy standing quietly near the wall. The boy no one had believed. And in that moment, one question burned in every mind in the room. Who was he? The sound of the monitor grew stronger, steadier, impossible to ignore. Beep, beep, beep. Each pulse echoed through the room like a drumbeat, announcing the return of life itself. For a moment, no one moved, as if they were afraid the sound might vanish if they breathed too loudly. Then the silence shattered. Nurses rushed forward, their shoes striking the floor in quick, sharp steps. Doctors leaned over the bed, checking Daniel's pulse, adjusting oxygen lines, calling out numbers, their voices urgent and shaken. The machines, silent only moments ago, now hummed and flickered with activity. One doctor stared at the monitor, blinking as if trying to wake from a dream. Heart rate rising, he said, almost in disbelief. Another nurse checked Daniel's chest, then looked up, her eyes wide. He's breathing. He's actually breathing. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet there was life returning, second by second, right in front of them. Richard Halvorson felt his knees weaken. He reached for the side of the bed to steady himself, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Just minutes ago, his son had been gone. The world had collapsed into silence. And now, Daniel's chest was rising and falling, faint but real. How? Richard whispered, the word barely leaving his lips. No one answered, because the answer was standing quietly near the wall, unnoticed for a moment in the chaos. The boy had stepped back, his thin shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't proud. He simply watched, his tired eyes following the movement around the bed, as if making sure Daniel was truly safe. Slowly, one by one, the people in the room began to notice him again. The nurses stopped whispering. The doctors turned. Even the guards near the door looked at him differently now. The disbelief, the dismissal, the quiet irritation that filled their faces earlier, all of it was gone. Now there was only awe. One of the senior doctors stepped toward him, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its sharp edge. Where did you learn that? The boy hesitated. He looked down at his hands, as if the answer were written there, hidden in the small scars and worn skin. My mother, he said softly. The room grew still again, but this silence was different. It wasn't heavy with despair. It was filled with listening. She used to be a nurse, the boy continued, his voice low but steady. In a small village, we didn't have machines like these. No monitors, no big rooms, just people and what we knew. The doctors exchanged glances. None of them spoke. She told me sometimes, the boy said, the body forgets how to live, and sometimes it just needs a moment, and the right touch to remember. His voice faltered slightly, and for the first time, the calm in his eyes cracked. She taught me, he added quietly. She showed me where to press, how to listen, how to feel for the small things most people miss. A nurse swallowed, her eyes glistening. One of the doctors spoke gently now, as if afraid to break something fragile. Where is your mother now? The boy didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the floor. She died last winter, he said at last. We couldn't afford her medicine. The words were simple. There was no anger in them, no bitterness, just a quiet truth, spoken without drama. But those words struck the room harder than any shout ever could. Silence fell again, and this time it was heavy with something else. Shame. The doctors who had dismissed him felt it. The guards who had reached to drag him away felt it. Even Richard felt it, deep in his chest, a weight he had never known before. A boy who had nothing, had just saved the life of someone who had everything. Richard looked at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. Not at the torn clothes or the bare feet, not at the thin frame or the tired face. He saw something else now. Strength, quiet courage, a kind of dignity that did not come from wealth or power, but from something far deeper. Gratitude rose in Richard's chest, sharp and overwhelming, but it was mixed with something unfamiliar. Humility. For years, he had believed that money could solve anything, that power could open any door, fix any problem, protect the people he loved from the harshness of the world. And yet, when the moment came, when his son's life hung by a thread, it wasn't wealth that saved him. It was a barefoot boy who slept on the streets. Daniel stirred slightly in the bed, a faint movement of his fingers. The nurse leaned closer, checking his breathing, her face lighting with cautious relief. He's stabilizing, she said softly. The word spread through the room like warmth after a long winter. Shoulders relaxed. Breaths were released. The impossible had happened, and now reality was slowly catching up. But Richard couldn't take his eyes off the boy. What's your name? He asked quietly. The boy looked up, surprised, as if he were not used to being asked such a question. Eli, he said. Richard nodded slowly, repeating the name in his mind, as if committing it to memory. Eli. The boy shifted slightly, as if uncomfortable with so many eyes on him. He glanced once more at Daniel, then turned as if to leave, his step slow, almost hesitant. Wait, Richard said. Eli stopped. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. The billionaire and the homeless boy stood facing each other, the distance between them filled with everything that had just happened. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. How do you thank someone for giving you back your child? How do you measure a debt like that? Before he could find the answer, a doctor called his name urgently, asking him to come to the bedside. Daniel's condition needed attention, needed decisions, needed a father. Richard turned for just a second, and when he looked back, Eli was already walking toward the door. No one stopped him. No one spoke. They simply watched as the boy who had changed everything stepped quietly out into the hallway, his figure growing smaller with every step, until he disappeared from sight. And as the door slowly closed behind him, one thought lingered in Richard Halvorson's mind, heavy and unshakable. Who was that boy? And how could someone in the world ignored carry a gift powerful enough to bring life back from silence? The day Daniel walked out of the hospital, the sky was bright and clear, as if the world itself had decided to begin again. Cameras flashed near the entrance. Nurses stood in small groups, smiling as they watched the boy step through the glass doors, his hand resting in his father's. Daniel looked thinner, a little pale, but alive, fully alive. And to Richard Halvorson, that single truth was worth more than every building he owned, more than every account, every deal, every number that had once defined his life. Daniel looked up at his father and smiled. It was a simple smile, the kind most people would not notice. But Richard felt his chest tighten, because weeks earlier he had believed he would never see that smile again. Reporters called out questions, voices rising in excitement. But Richard barely heard them. His mind was somewhere else. Not in the hospital, not in the crowd, not even in the present. He was thinking about a barefoot boy walking quietly out of a hospital room, disappearing into a hallway, without waiting for thanks. That image stayed with him. It followed him home. It followed him into meetings, into quiet dinners, into the long nights when the house was still. Gratitude has a way of doing that. It doesn't fade. It grows heavier until it demands action. So Richard began to search. At first, it seemed impossible. No last name, no address, just a face, a voice, and a name. Eli. The city was large, and boys like Eli were everywhere and nowhere at the same time, blending into sidewalks, bus stations, shelters, and corners most people walked past without seeing. But Richard did not give up. Days turned into weeks. He spoke to shelter workers, security guards, street vendors, anyone who might have seen a thin boy with tired eyes and quiet hands. Many shook their heads. Some shrugged. A few said, maybe, but nothing came of it. And then one cold evening, a driver spotted him. He's there, sir, the driver said softly, pointing toward a small park near a crowded street. Richard stepped out of the car slowly. The park was nearly empty. A few benches sat under dim lights, and on one of them, curled beneath a thin, torn blanket, was Eli. He was asleep, one arm wrapped around himself to keep warm, his face peaceful in a way that only deep exhaustion can bring. The city moved around him, cars passing, voices in the distance, but he slept as if he learned long ago to rest wherever he could. Richard approached quietly and sat down on the bench beside him. For a while, he said nothing. He simply sat there, listening to the distant sounds of traffic, watching the boy who had changed his life without asking for anything in return. After a few minutes, Eli stirred. His eyes opened slowly, blinking in confusion. When he saw Richard sitting beside him, he stiffened, unsure, almost ready to run. "It's okay," Richard said gently. Eli sat up, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. "Your son, is he okay?" he asked immediately. The question surprised Richard. Not "why are you here?" Not "what do you want?" but concern for someone else. "He's well," Richard said softly. "Because of you." Eli looked down at his hands. "I just helped." Richard shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You gave me back my son." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet of two people who understood something words could not fully explain. "I owe you everything," Richard said at last. Eli shook his head again. "You don't owe me," he said. "My mother used to say, if you can help someone, you should. That's all." Richard felt those words sink deep into his heart. So simple, so clear, and yet they carried more truth than all the speeches he had heard in boardrooms over the years. But Richard had already made his decision. Within days, Eli had a place to live, not a shelter, not a temporary room, a real home, warm, safe, quiet. At first, the boy seemed uneasy, as if he expected it all to disappear the moment he fell asleep. But slowly, little by little, he began to believe it was real. Richard arranged for him to go to school. At first, Eli struggled. Not because he wasn't intelligent, but because classrooms felt strange after years of surviving on the streets. But he worked harder than anyone. Late nights, early mornings, determined, focused, driven by something deeper than ambition. He never forgot why he was there. Years passed. Daniel grew stronger, healthier, his laughter filling the halls of his home once more. And Eli grew too, not just taller, not just older, but stronger in spirit, in purpose. The memory of his mother stayed with him, guiding him, reminding him of why he had pressed his hand against a silent chest in a hospital room long ago. And one day, Eli stood at the entrance of medical school, acceptance letter in his hand, his heart pounding with disbelief and gratitude. He wasn't there because of charity. He was there because of who he was. And because someone had seen his worth. Years later, in a large auditorium filled with young doctors and students, Richard Halvorson stood at a podium. His hair was grayer now, his voice slower, but his eyes were steady. "My son is alive today," he said, "because of a boy the world almost ignored." The room was silent, listening. "That day," Richard continued, "I learned something I will never forget. Wealth can buy the best machines in the world. It can build hospitals, hire experts, and open doors, but it cannot measure the value of a human heart." He paused, letting the words settle. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "the person who changes your life is the one people walk past every day without seeing." In the audience, Eli sat quietly, wearing a white coat now, his eyes reflecting the same calm strength he had carried as a child. And the lesson spread far beyond that room, carried in the hearts of everyone who heard the story. Sometimes the people the world overlooks, the ones without power, without wealth, without titles, are the very ones sent to remind us what humanity truly means.